journey through Lent continues. The theme of healing is with us as we go. I'm really interested to see how each week's readings seem to be unfolding in quite an organic way. We began with seeing things as they are, and then we had the theme of lamenting, and then last week the theme of repenting. And this week we might hear it as a gospel of returning. How many of you hold this parable of the prodigal son dear to your heart? It is certainly one of the better known stories. You know, the prodigal returns is common to our lexicon. I was interested as I looked at it that the kind of word prodigal, in my head I thought, oh, it must be something to do with the bad one coming back. But when I actually looked at it, it translates as I drive forth, squander, waste, use up, consume. A prodigal is given to extravagant expenditure, lavish and wasteful. So the prodigality of the son is in his wastefulness. Well, the stage is set for the telling of this parable, because judgment has been passed on the tax collectors and sinners that Jesus welcomes and eats with. And as we heard, the parable tells of a wealthy landowner who has two sons. At the bidding of his younger one, the father divests himself of his wealth and land to give equal share to his two sons. And the younger one decides to take all of that inheritance and leave. And he lives lavishly and wastefully until his share is used up. And then in the place where he is, famine descends and he is forced to eke out a living feeding pigs. And as you probably know, a pig is a creature of particular aversion in Judaism, and those pigs are eating better. So it further confounds you like the depths to which this younger son has sunk. He has nothing. And then he remembers. Without expectation of restoration, he chooses to return home to his family. The prodigal returns to his father's full-bodied embrace and utter delight, marked with extravagant celebration. But then the constant, tirelessly faithful older brother, the only one tending what remains of the family property, on whom his father and now his recalcitrant brother will depend, is rightfully offended. His presence has never been celebrated with such largesse. The father takes him and he reminds him. He reminds the older brother of their unquestioned oneness, one with the other. And the younger brother had chosen to sever his connection. He who was as good as dead is alive. This prodigal brother's circumstances led him to repent, to turn, and to choose to return. It seems to me there are different economies at play here. There is the economies of land and inheritance and livelihood, for sure. There are also economies of grace. Only in an economy of grace could the lost son find his way back to himself and his belonging. The father invites the older brother to see this and therefore to join with him in celebrating the restoration of wholeness of his brother and therefore all of them. It is a great story, and it is a very comforting story, especially for any of us who throw in caution and sensibility to the wind and lived wastefully without concern for our impact on those who love us. Redemption is always possible. Then one day, I was at a self-checkout at my local warehouse. And I was waiting while Gregory purchased a couple of items. And I heard this conversation taking place between a woman and a staff member, and I turned slightly to see. There was a woman there, maybe in her 40s or 50s. The older you get, the harder the guess. She had worn clothing, but she was very tidily dressed. Her hair was tied back and her dignity was intact. Across her trolley, she had 3 small garments, children's clothing. She wanted to pay cash for the items, and you can only use your card there. So she was talking to the woman there to help her. And the woman told her the 3 garments totaled $6.85. So carefully, the woman had a small plastic, one of those zip cash bags, and she started counting out silver coins, one by one, into the hand of the shop assistant. She looked at the empty bag and she looked at her purse, and she reached in for another bag, carefully measured coins, started counting them out. I got quite tearful. I felt quite ashamed of the largesse, everything that was around us being easily and casually acquired. And this woman with her great dignity, coin by coin, was counting out $6.85 to buy 3 small garments in all likelihood for a grandchild. Part of me wanted to rescue, wanted to leap in and say, I'll pay for it, but I didn't want to destroy her dignity, which was so intact. Well, the prodigal son story just happened to be looping through my head at the same time. And as I observed this interchange, I was struck by something. In this parable, there are some social assumptions being made. What if you were in despair and you had no money to return to? What if you didn't know who your father or your family was, or it was far too dangerous to even consider going back there? What if you didn't know where you came from? You had no land and no identity to return to, or you could no longer return there. How would this parable resonate? Would you feel included? Or do you need to have those things to be included? I got a bit grumpy. In fact, I became quite irritated by the parable completely. But I sat with that discomfort and I sought to discern what the parable might be saying beneath that anger that had fired in me about what I perceived was injustice. And I came to recognize I hear it from a place of privilege. I hear the parable and make assumptions about it because of my worldview and my life experience. And I remembered a gospel music event that I went to some years ago. It was in Edgerton in Martha's Vineyard, which sounds far more posh than it was. I was staying with my sister and they have a holiday place there. The event featured a number of African American singers and groups and musicians from a range of churches that had come to the Martha's Vineyard for this concert as a fundraiser from the mainland. It was an informal sort of worship occasion with a loose playlist order, and each played for the other half the time. Different groups or individuals took the stage in turn to sing and to worship. Testifying to their faith, songs were interwoven with outbursts of joyous words of celebration or stories of the terrible journeys they'd travelled, and all the while in the background the music and the rhythm kept going. As I listened, I heard a theme. I heard a theology emerging that surprised me. I turned to my sister and I said, "This faith is upside down to me." Many of these beautiful people stood within the lineage of those who had been slaves, and many still lived the struggle of racial oppression. Their stories and their tears of joy and thanksgiving arose out of suffering. Tears of joy and thanksgiving shed not from being relieved of suffering, but that in their suffering, God, Jesus, met them. They knew this presence with them. They knew it. It gave them hope. It told them they were worthy, that they were not abandoned or alone, who they were. Their identity as God's beloved children could not be taken from them. Whatever their context, this could not be diminished. And they rejoiced in a way that is hard to see in any other context. So this memory caused me to look again at the prodigal son story, to look not at the beginning and at the end, but to the middle. Where is the younger son in this parable when he is met in a way that causes him to return? He's in the field with pigs that are eating while no one gave him anything. And then we hear these words. When he came to himself, he said, "Here I am, dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father." In the midst of his despair, he came to himself. He remembers, and it impelled him to seek to be remembered in his father. It is not when he is better. It is not when he has fixed everything. He has no certainty of his reception, but in the desperate intimacy of his despair, his heart is open to receive the gift of coming to himself. And it propels him to return to a context of provision and sustenance as he is. He retraces his steps towards healing. With the different economies at play in this parable, I think the economy of prodigal grace is the absolute hardest for us to embrace. Acceptance as we are, right now, as you are. Forgiveness